It was just another day in Karen's life, one that seemed ordinary enough at first glance. A high school teacher in her late 30s, Karen had spent years shaping the minds of teenagers with her strong opinions, no-nonsense attitude, and an unwavering belief in discipline. Her day-to-day existence was familiar, a blend of routine and responsibility. She had spent the morning grading papers, sending off emails to colleagues, and attending to the endless stack of administrative tasks that came with being a teacher. But today, there was something different. Karen had been preparing for a business trip, a professional development conference for educators in another city. The prospect of a few days away from school seemed like a welcome escape, even if it was only a temporary break. As she packed her bag in the early afternoon, Karen's thoughts were already on the trip. She wasn't particularly fond of flying, but it was a necessary part of the job. Her nerves had always flared up on airplanes, but today it was more about the work waiting for her at the conference. She had a reputation to maintain. Karen always had to be in control, at work and in her personal life. Her colleagues respected her, but at times they found her need to manage every situation a bit overwhelming. She took pride in her meticulous planning and organization, traits she believed set her apart. In her living room, Karen's son, Matt, was lounging on the couch, absorbed in his phone. He was 16, a typical teenager who seemed more interested in scrolling through social media than engaging in anything that required effort. Karen had always found his dependence on his phone a source of frustration, but she learned to pick her battles. She reminded him once again about the importance of focus, though she knew it wouldn't make much of a difference. Today, however, was different. She had made a conscious decision to go phone-free for the next few days. Her own device, an iPhone, had become a source of frustration in recent months. She'd lost count of how many times she'd seen people lost in their screens, disconnected from the world around them. She couldn't stand it. The constant ping of notifications, the endless scroll of irrelevant posts, and the overwhelming sense that technology was taking over every aspect of life. Karen, in her usual way, had drawn a hard line. She had a few work-related apps on her phone, of course, but she wasn't one of those people who needed to check every notification. As she threw a few items into her bag, books, travel documents, toiletries, her iPhone sat on the counter, just out of reach. She wasn't going to be using it much. She needed this trip to reset, to escape the constant buzz of connectivity that had become all too familiar. Matt, as usual, didn't seem interested in her lecture about being more mindful of screen time. He gave her a half-hearted nod as she left the house, reminding him to take care of the house while she was away. She closed the door behind her, already looking forward to the quiet solitude of the flight. As she drove to the airport, she reflected on her life, on how she had gotten to this point. Her career was successful, but at times, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something. The airport was its usual chaos. Karen breezed through security, checked her luggage, and found her way to the gate. She had a bit of time to spare, so she settled into one of the seats near the window, watching the planes taxi on the runway. She pulled out a small notebook and began reviewing the conference materials, making sure everything was in order. She had prepared well for this trip. Nothing would be left to chance. Her only concern was that the plane would be on time. As the boarding call was announced, Karen stood up, grabbed her bag, and made her way to the gate. There was nothing particularly remarkable about the flight. No turbulence, no delays, just the hum of engines as they ascended into the clouds. She sat back in her seat, glancing out the window, allowing her mind to wander. As usual, she didn't pay much attention to the passengers around her. She wasn't particularly interested in small talk, and her book kept her busy. But then, as the flight entered its cruising altitude, the unexpected happened. It started with a simple disagreement, something trivial, something that, in any other context, wouldn't have even registered. But here, in the confined space of an airplane, it escalated rapidly. A passenger in the row in front of Karen was playing loud music on his phone, and she couldn't ignore it. Normally, Karen would have let it slide, But something about this moment triggered her. She stood up, tapped the man on the shoulder, and asked him to turn it down. The man, clearly annoyed, didn't take kindly to her request. A brief exchange of words turned into a louder argument. The flight attendants tried to intervene, but Karen's frustration had reached a boiling point. Her voice grew louder, more insistent, as she insisted that the man respect her request. She could feel eyes on her, but at that moment, she didn't care. This was something she could control. As the argument reached its peak, Karen's eyes fell on her iPhone, which had been sitting idly in the seat pocket in front of her. The phone, once a tool of convenience, had now become a symbol of her frustration. Without thinking, in the heat of the moment, she grabbed it and hurled it toward the bathroom door, where it slid into the small, cramped space of the airplane's tiny restroom. The flight attendants were stunned. Other passengers stared at her, some in disbelief, others in shock. A few seconds later, as Karen's anger subsided, she realized what she had just done. Her iPhone was now out of reach, and no one was going to be able to retrieve it. She had flushed it away in a fit of rage, and it wasn't coming back. The realization hit her like a wave. What had she just done? The moment of impulse had triggered an event that would change everything, and she knew it. As the plane continued its flight, the atmosphere became charged with tension. The flight attendants worked to keep everyone calm, but Karen sat in stunned silence, regretting her impulsive decision. What had started as a minor irritation had snowballed into a life-altering incident. The woman who had always prided herself on control was now facing the consequences of her own actions. What was once a routine business trip had turned into a chaotic, uncontrollable situation. And it was only just beginning. The silence on the plane was deafening. Karen sat frozen in her seat, her hands gripping the armrests as the realization of what she had done began to sink in. The moment felt like it was suspended in time, a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. She had thrown her phone away in a fit of rage, a decision, impulsive and rash, that now seemed utterly out of character. But it was done. There was no turning back. The flight attendants had stopped moving, their eyes flicking toward her, uncertain whether to approach. The other passengers were either pretending not to notice or staring at her, some with disbelief, others with judgment. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the sting of humiliation. One of the flight attendants, a young woman with dark, concerned eyes, approached her cautiously. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" she asked softly, her voice careful, almost as if she were speaking to someone in a fragile state of mind. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. She couldn't bring herself to admit what had just happened, couldn't acknowledge the sheer absurdity of her actions. She had always prided herself on being level-headed, a person who could keep calm in any situation. But this was a mistake of monumental proportions. I need to go to the bathroom," Karen stammered, trying to recover some semblance of control over her emotions. The flight attendant gave her a hesitant nod, but as Karen started to move, she realized the door to the restroom was already locked. A voice came over the intercom, announcing that the plane had reached its cruising altitude, and no one was allowed to move about the cabin yet. Karen's frustration flared again. She needed to escape, to get away from the stares, the whispers, the feeling that she was completely unraveling. The plane continued its journey, but for Karen, it felt like everything had stopped. She couldn't focus on the book she had brought. The constant hum of the engines, the occasional chatter from passengers, all of it seemed so distant now. The only thing that occupied her mind was the image of her phone, her iPhone, now lodged somewhere in the airplane's tiny, cramped restroom. She imagined it stuck in the pipes, its shiny surface now covered in dirt, completely useless. And she, the woman who always kept a tight grip on her world, had been the one to cause it. How could she have done something so careless? As the minutes dragged on, Karen could hear the sound of the other passengers, some muttering under their breath, others clearly trying to avoid eye contact. The air around her felt thick, heavy with the unspoken judgment that seemed to radiate from everyone in the cabin. She could feel their eyes on her, even when she wasn't looking. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The awkward silence was only broken when the flight attendants came around with the beverage cart. One of them paused in front of Karen, offering a polite smile. "Would you like something to drink, ma'am?" the attendant asked, her tone neutral but strained. Karen shook her head, unable to speak, her throat dry and tight. She could feel her hands beginning to tremble, the weight of the situation finally crashing down on her. The young attendant lingered for a moment, watching Karen's face, perhaps sensing that something was deeply wrong. With a slight nod, the attendant moved on, leaving Karen alone in her spiraling thoughts. It wasn't until the plane hit some minor turbulence that Karen snapped back to reality. The seatbelt sign illuminated, and passengers began to buckle up, shifting in their seats. But Karen couldn't focus on the turbulence. She was too busy wrestling with her own thoughts. How had things escalated so quickly? One minute, she had been mildly irritated by a loud phone, and the next, her own phone had been sent to its watery grave in the restroom of an airplane. The shame felt suffocating. She knew that, back home, people would be talking about this. Her colleagues, her friends, maybe even her students. The viral nature of social media meant that by the time she landed, everyone would know what had happened. There would be no hiding from it. Karen's mind raced. Could she still retrieve her phone? Could she somehow go into the bathroom and get it back? No, the flight attendants had already locked it. And besides, she didn't even know if they would allow her to disturb the area again. And even if she could, what was the point? Her iPhone, which had once felt like an essential part of her life, was now a symbol of her failure. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that it wasn't just about the phone. It was about her own lack of control. She had let a trivial argument with a stranger turn into a catastrophe, all because of a simple, thoughtless action. As the plane began its descent toward its destination, Karen's emotions were all over the place. The air was heavy with the kind of awkward tension that only a public humiliation could bring. She could feel herself shrinking in her seat, trying to shrink away from the world that now seemed to be staring at her every move. She wondered how her colleagues would react to her arrival. Would they already know about the incident? Would they be gossiping behind her back? And how would she even explain what had happened? She felt like a joke, a punchline in a story that had yet to reach its conclusion. The plane finally touched down, the jolt of landing snapping Karen out of her spiraling thoughts. As the seatbelt sign clicked off, she gathered her things quickly, trying to avoid the gaze of the other passengers. She was the first to get up, her bag clutched tightly in her hand, as if it could somehow shield her from the embarrassment she felt. She tried to walk briskly off the plane, but her legs felt like lead. The flight attendants watched her closely, perhaps out of curiosity or concern, but Karen kept her head down, moving toward the terminal without acknowledging anyone. The first thing she did when she stepped into the terminal was check her phone. She knew it was probably useless, but she had to see for herself. The screen lit up, and to her surprise, the device still seemed to be functional, despite the chaos it had endured. She opened the social media app on instinct, and what she saw made her stomach drop. People had already begun sharing the incident. Videos, screenshots, and memes of the Karen who flushed her iPhone. The comments flooded in, some mocking her, others condemning her, but all of them making it clear that Karen was now the subject of an online spectacle. Her heart raced, the embarrassment swelling within her chest. She had been reduced to a meme, a viral moment. But deep down, she knew that the real consequences were still to come. The public fallout from her impulsive decision had only just begun. And soon, it would affect more than just her pride. The next few hours felt like a blur for Karen. She made her way to the conference hotel, trying to remain as composed as possible, but her mind kept racing back to the events on the plane. Her stomach churned with anxiety, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the world was watching her every move. She checked her phone repeatedly, each time feeling more disheartened as the videos, memes, and comments piled up. People were calling her the iPhone flusher, and the ridicule was swift and merciless. She had become a symbol of irrational behavior, a woman who had let a moment of frustration spiral out of control. By the time she arrived at the hotel, Karen felt like she had been through an emotional war. The weight of the incident sat heavily on her shoulders, and she could barely focus on the conference activities she had come all this way to attend. She was supposed to be networking, learning, and growing professionally, but her every thought kept returning to what had happened earlier that day. The laughter and mockery echoing in her head made it impossible to concentrate. She checked into her room and dropped her bag on the bed. As she sat down on the edge, her phone buzzed with a new notification. It was from her colleague, Rachel, back at the school. The message read, "I can't believe what happened on the plane. We're all talking about it here. Are you okay?" Karen's heart sank. It hadn't taken long for the news to spread, even though she had hoped it would be contained. What had started as a small personal incident had quickly spiraled into a full-blown spectacle. The internet was ruthless, and her colleagues had joined the chorus of judgment. She could almost hear Rachel's voice in her head, sympathetic but with an undercurrent of curiosity, eager to gossip. Karen debated whether to respond. Should she explain herself, apologize, or should she remain silent, hoping that the frenzy would die down on its own? In the end, she chose to keep it brief. "I'm fine. Just a really embarrassing situation. I'll be back tomorrow." The response felt hollow. She had been the one to make the mistake, but it was clear that people were already passing judgment on her, forming opinions before they even knew the full story. The irony was not lost on her. She had spent years teaching her students the importance of critical thinking, of examining situations from multiple angles, but here she was, subject to the same kind of snap judgment that she had warned against. It wasn't just a matter of people laughing at her. It was the realization that they were doing so because they didn't understand her at all. The evening dragged on, and Karen found herself unable to escape the feeling of shame. At dinner, she forced herself to participate in the group conversations, but her mind was elsewhere. She smiled and nodded, pretending to be interested in the discussions about new educational methods and teaching strategies. But the truth was, all she could think about was her phone, now the object of ridicule. She had always been proud of her professionalism, of the way she carried herself in the classroom and beyond. But now, all of that seemed to have been erased by a single, ill-considered action. Back in her hotel room, Karen lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The weight of the situation settled over her like a blanket, suffocating her. She had tried to escape it, tried to compartmentalize, but it had followed her here. The ridicule wasn't just coming from strangers. It was coming from people she knew, people she had respected. She could already hear their voices in her head, whispers about the woman who had lost control on a plane, the one who had made a spectacle of herself. It was like her identity had been hijacked by that one impulsive moment. The next morning, Karen reluctantly left the hotel and headed to the conference hall. She wasn't sure what she expected to find, but when she entered the crowded room filled with fellow educators, the atmosphere was different. It wasn't just about the sessions and the lectures anymore. It was about her. Everywhere she turned, she could hear snippets of conversation. Some people were talking about teaching methods, sure, but others were whispering about her, some casting furtive glances, others outright staring. Her reputation, carefully crafted over the years, was now tainted by a moment of frustration. The realization was crushing. She wasn't just the iPhone flusher to the internet. She was becoming that person in real life, too. During lunch, Karen found herself sitting alone at a corner table. She had hoped to enjoy a quiet meal, but it was hard to concentrate when she felt like everyone was watching her. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from her best friend, Amanda. "Karen, what happened on the plane? I heard the news. Are you okay? You've got to tell me your side of the story." Karen stared at the message, wondering how to respond. How could she explain what had happened? How could she tell Amanda that in a moment of anger, she had let her emotions control her, that she had thrown away something important in a way that made no sense. She didn't even understand it herself. It was like she had lost all sense of rationality. She didn't respond right away, but as the day wore on, she began to feel the weight of the expectations that came with her job. She was a teacher, someone who was supposed to set an example for others. She had always held herself to a high standard, and now that standard had been shattered by her own actions. The guilt gnawed at her, the sense that she had let everyone down, including herself. That evening, back at her hotel, Karen spent hours scrolling through social media. She was looking for something, some sign that things were starting to die down, but they weren't. The videos of her tantrum were still circulating, the memes still flooding every platform. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she never had before. But amidst the sea of mocking comments, there were a few that caught her attention. Messages from people who had experienced similar moments of frustration, people who understood what it felt like to lose control. It was then that she realized the true impact of her actions. This wasn't just about her humiliation. It was about the way her moment of weakness resonated with others. Some of them were laughing at her, sure, but others were connecting with her, empathizing with her struggle. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to turn this situation around. But first, she would have to face the consequences, not just the public ones, but the personal ones. And that meant coming to terms with what had happened and figuring out what to do next. Karen's world had been turned upside down, and she knew it wasn't just about the phone anymore. It was about how she would rebuild from this. The question was, could she? The aftermath of the plane incident lingered over Karen like a dark cloud as she returned home from the conference. She had spent days in the city, trying to avoid thinking about what had happened, but the quiet of her own house brought the reality rushing back. It was strange. She had come back to familiar surroundings, yet nothing felt the same. Her phone was still with her, though barely functional. Its screen cracked and slightly warped from its plunge into the airplane restroom, but it had been replaced with the kind of nagging reminder that her entire world had been turned upside down. It wasn't just her phone that was broken, it was her reputation, her sense of control, and in many ways, the idea that she could always keep everything together. Karen walked through the front door, greeted only by the soft sound of the television playing in the other room. Matt was on the couch, his eyes glued to the screen, not bothering to look up as she entered. He had already seen the memes. He'd made sure of it, mocking her as she had walked out the door to the airport days ago. The silence between them was palpable, heavier than the usual tension of a teenager who just didn't care. He hadn't asked about the conference, about what she'd learned, or even about how she was feeling. The chasm between them had widened in the past year, but now it felt deeper, more strained. His indifference wasn't the worst part. It was the sense that Karen was invisible to him. And worse still, that her own mistakes had further alienated her from him. He hadn't asked about the incident on the plane, either, but she could feel it hanging in the air like a dirty secret, one neither of them wanted to acknowledge. The phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message of sympathy or concern. Instead, it was an email from the school board, titled simply, "Request for a meeting regarding school technology policies." Karen stared at the subject line for a moment, a knot forming in her stomach. She had half expected this. After the viral explosion of the airplane incident, the topic of technology in schools had come up, again and again, even before her public debacle. And now, it seemed that her incident had been the tipping point. She opened the email and found an invitation to a meeting the following Monday. The topic, a potential school-wide ban on phones, with a request for her input as a teacher with strong opinions on the matter. At first, Karen thought it might be a joke, but as she reread the email, she realized that the school administration was actually taking her situation seriously. They wanted her insight into the policy on a school-wide ban, the very thing she had been railing against for months. Karen knew her stance on technology in the classroom wasn't popular, but this was taking it to another level. She'd always believed in setting boundaries with technology, but she had never thought that it would escalate to the point where her personal meltdown could influence a larger institutional decision. Her mind raced. Could she still influence this decision in a way that made sense, or had her outburst just given more fuel to the fire of those who felt that technology was a destructive force in education? The school board was likely eager to capitalize on the incident and use it as evidence that phones and other devices were indeed harmful distractions in the classroom. She could already imagine the arguments swirling, with the meeting focus on her out-of-control behavior as proof that phones were a major problem. Or could it shift to a more thoughtful discussion on how technology could be used responsibly in schools? She didn't know, but one thing was certain. She couldn't hide from it anymore. The very thing she had tried to distance herself from, her own opinions on the matter of phone usage, was about to become her most pressing concern. The meeting day arrived faster than she had expected, and Karen walked into the room feeling the weight of the situation. She had barely had time to process everything that had happened: the public shame, the personal doubts, and the tension with her son. Now, sitting at the long conference table with the principal, the vice principal, and other members of the school board, Karen realized just how much her emotional breakdown on the plane had changed everything. "I know this is a sensitive topic, Karen," Principal Hall said as they all settled into their seats, "but after what happened on your flight, we feel it might be time to address the issue of phone usage in our school more seriously. We're considering implementing a ban on phones during school hours, but we need to hear your thoughts on it." Karen felt the eyes of the room on her. It wasn't just the eyes of the board members. It was the weight of her own failures, her recent loss of control, and her growing sense that she might be the wrong person to lead this conversation. The room was silent, waiting for her response. The pressure was suffocating, and for a moment, Karen wondered if she should just keep quiet, let them make their own decisions. But then she remembered why she'd become a teacher in the first place: the desire to shape minds, to create meaningful dialogue, and to set an example for her students. If she didn't speak now, if she didn't try to steer the conversation towards something more constructive, then all of her efforts in the classroom would mean nothing. "I think we need to be careful here," Karen began, her voice shaky but determined. "I've been pretty vocal about the need to limit phone usage in the classroom, but I also learned something recently. What happened on that plane? It wasn't just about technology. It was about my own emotional response to a situation. I let something small get to me, and it had huge consequences. I think we need to be mindful that banning phones entirely could alienate students who depend on them. Some students use their phones to stay connected to family members, for educational purposes, or even for mental health reasons." The room was quiet as Karen spoke, and she could see the board members nodding thoughtfully. The conversation wasn't as hostile as she had feared. Instead of jumping to conclusions, they seemed willing to listen. "What do you suggest?" asked Vice Principal Thompson, clearly intrigued. Karen hesitated for a moment. Her knee-jerk reaction was to suggest more regulation, more restrictions, but she realized that wouldn't solve the deeper problem. "I think we need to balance accountability with autonomy. We can set clear expectations for phone usage, create designated times when phones are allowed for educational purposes, and perhaps even integrate technology into lessons more strategically. But a complete ban, as appealing as it might seem right now, could have unintended consequences." There was a pause as the board members processed her words. For the first time in days, Karen felt like her thoughts were clear again, like she wasn't just reacting out of shame or fear. She was offering a solution, not just a critique. The conversation moved forward, with Karen offering her suggestions and discussing potential guidelines that could give students more autonomy over their technology use, while also addressing the concerns of teachers and parents. By the end of the meeting, Karen had a sense of resolution. She had done more than just react. She had taken a step toward reclaiming the control she had lost. And while the decision about the phone policy was still up in the air, Karen felt a newfound sense of clarity. Her moment of weakness on that plane had changed her, yes, but it hadn't defined her. She realized now that change could come from the most unexpected places, even from the depths of public embarrassment. Her willingness to face her mistakes, to offer a measured, thoughtful approach, had not only helped shift the conversation at school, it had given her a sense of agency that had been missing for a long time. The Karen who had flushed her iPhone on a plane was now the Karen who could help guide the conversation towards something more meaningful for the future. The weeks that followed were a blur of emotions, meetings, and reflections as Karen navigated the aftermath of the plane incident and the school board's phone ban discussions. She felt like she was living in two separate realities, the one where she was a teacher, respected by her colleagues, and the one where she had become a viral sensation, a symbol of overblown frustration. The digital world continued to echo with memes and mockery, but at school, things were quieter. It seemed like people had moved on, though Karen knew better than to believe that. The sting of public embarrassment lingered. Her son, Matt, once indifferent to her presence, seemed to sense the change in her. Over the past few weeks, he had gradually begun to act differently around her. She couldn't tell if it was the fact that she had tried to take responsibility for her actions or if he was just trying to avoid talking about the incident. Still, the shift between them was noticeable. One evening, as they sat down to dinner in the quiet of their home, Matt surprised her by speaking first. "Mom, I saw what happened," he said, not looking up from his plate. I didn't think it was that big of a deal." Karen paused, unsure how to respond. She had expected something worse, either judgment or, worse yet, complete indifference. But this was something else. "You didn't think it was a big deal?" she asked softly, her voice betraying a hint of surprise. Matt shrugged. "I mean, yeah, it was weird, but you're human, right? People blow things out of proportion all the time." For a moment, Karen was taken aback. She had expected to be judged, to be seen as a failure, but Matt's words were unexpectedly grounding. Maybe, she thought, he was seeing her as a person again, not just the embarrassing Karen from the internet. Maybe he understood that we all have moments when we lose our way. "I'm sorry, Matt," she said, the weight of her earlier actions coming to the forefront again. "I wasn't proud of what I did." He nodded. "I get it, but don't beat yourself up about it. It happens to everyone." It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was a step toward healing. For the first time in weeks, Karen felt like she might have a chance to rebuild the trust and connection with her son that had begun to erode over time. She smiled, more genuinely than she had in a while, and they continued their meal in relative peace. But as much as she tried to convince herself that things were returning to normal, Karen couldn't escape the looming question of what had changed in her. The incident had forced her to confront her own flaws, not just as a teacher, but as a person. She had always been someone who prided herself on her discipline and control. The truth, she realized now, was that she had been afraid to let go of control, afraid of being vulnerable or uncertain. The incident had pulled her out of her carefully constructed world, and in its wake, she was left to sift through the rubble, searching for the pieces of herself she wanted to rebuild. It was around this time that Karen received a message that would shift her perspective even further. It was from Rachel, her colleague at school, who had been part of the discussions about the phone ban and the incident itself. The message was short and to the point, but it was enough to catch Karen's attention. "I'm proud of you. You really handled the meeting well. I think you've turned things around with the school." Karen blinked at the message, unsure what to make of it at first. Her emotions were still raw, and she hadn't realized how much she had been hoping for some kind of acknowledgement from her colleagues. The feedback from the board had been encouraging. But this felt different. Rachel's words were a validation of something she hadn't fully allowed herself to believe. That she could recover, that she could face the consequences of her actions and still have a positive impact on her school, her students, and herself. Later that week, Karen found herself at another meeting, this time with a group of her students who were part of a leadership program. They had asked her to be their guest speaker, to talk about handling failure and overcoming setbacks. Karen had been hesitant at first, unsure how to address her own mistakes without sounding like a hypocrite. But when she stood in front of the students, looking into their eager faces, something inside her shifted. She wasn't just going to tell them what they wanted to hear. She was going to be honest about her mistakes, her shame, and how she had worked through it. "I know many of you have seen what happened," Karen began, her voice steady but raw. "It's all over social media. And to be honest, it was one of the most embarrassing moments of my life. But I've learned something important from it. I learned that it's okay to be vulnerable, to admit when you've messed up. It's okay to not have all the answers. But what matters is how you pick yourself back up after you fall." As she spoke, Karen saw the students nodding along, some of them even smiling. They weren't judging her, they were connecting with her. And in that moment, Karen realized that perhaps her own journey was more important than the incident itself. She had the power to show them what it meant to own your mistakes and move forward, to be stronger because of them. The weeks that followed saw Karen slowly but surely making peace with her past actions. She had taken steps to address the phone policy at school, making sure that any new decision would be carefully thought out, balancing the need for structure with respect for students' autonomy. The community at school, too, seemed to rally around her, not in pity, but in recognition of the fact that everyone, even teachers, could slip up. By the time the school year drew to a close, Karen felt a sense of quiet triumph. It wasn't the kind of victory that was celebrated with fanfare or accolades, but it was one that mattered more. She had faced her own demons, learned from them, and come out the other side more whole than she had been before. And while she knew that people would always remember the iPhone flusher incident, Karen also knew that it wasn't the only thing that defined her. The lessons she had learned, and the way she had applied them, would stay with her long after the jokes and memes had faded. One afternoon, as Karen sat in her classroom, watching her students engage in a lively discussion about an upcoming project, she reflected on how far she had come. She had been humbled, yes, but she had also been transformed. Her relationship with her son had improved, her connection with her colleagues had strengthened, and most importantly, she had learned to let go of the need for constant control. The incident had taught her something invaluable, that it wasn't the mistakes we make that define us, but how we move forward after them. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Karen stood up, feeling more confident in her own skin than she had in years. Her phone buzzed once more, and this time, it wasn't a message about her past mistakes. It was a notification about a new educational app she could use in her classroom. She smiled, realizing that for the first time in a long while, she was ready to embrace the future, both the good and the bad, on her own terms. The final weeks of the school year flew by faster than Karen had expected. It was almost surreal how quickly things had started to return to normal, or at least a new kind of normal. The viral incident, once a source of constant dread and embarrassment, had slowly begun to fade from the public's memory. But for Karen, the lessons learned during those tumultuous days had become the bedrock of her transformation. She had come to understand that failure wasn't a scar, but an opportunity to reframe her life and her approach to teaching, parenting, and personal growth. Still, even as things settled back into routine, she found herself questioning the long-term effects of the choices she had made, and the new path she was forging for herself. It had been months since the phone incident on the plane, and Karen had learned to take the jokes, the memes, and the mockery in stride. At first, it had felt like an insurmountable burden, a weight that pressed down on her every moment of her day. But somewhere along the way, she realized that the more she tried to control how others saw her, the more it would consume her. The people who truly mattered would see her for who she was, someone who made mistakes, yes, but also someone who was capable of owning those mistakes and evolving. The mocking comments, the viral clips, they no longer held power over her. They had become part of her past, not her identity. One day, Karen found herself in the school courtyard, watching a group of students huddled around their phones, absorbed in whatever content they were consuming. It was a familiar sight, one she had long debated, whether the technology in her classroom was serving the students or distracting them. At first, she had been adamant that the overuse of phones in school was detrimental, especially after her outburst on the plane. But now she saw things differently. The phone ban, which had been suggested by the school board as a reaction to her incident, was still under discussion. However, Karen had spent weeks considering an alternative solution, something that bridged the divide between complete restriction and full autonomy. She remembered the meeting where she had spoken about a balanced approach to technology. At that time, it had felt like a small victory to simply have a voice in the conversation. But now, Karen was determined to bring about change, not just for her students, but for herself as well. She no longer saw technology as the enemy. It was a tool, a means of communication and learning, and it was time for her to embrace that fact. The next step was presenting her thoughts to the school board. The previous proposal had been based solely on the chaos of the plane incident, an emotional response that hadn't taken into account the broader implications of such a ban. Karen's new plan, however, was different. She suggested a more flexible approach. Designated times for phone usage during class, structured around educational activities, and a comprehensive digital literacy program that taught students how to use their phones responsibly. She also proposed a mentoring program where older students could help guide younger ones in the responsible use of technology, turning the negative narrative of her own iPhone flush into a lesson in maturity and accountability. When the meeting arrived, Karen felt both a sense of pride and nervousness. Her proposal was not the easy solution, the one that could just be voted on and done with. It was a challenge, one that asked her colleagues and the school board to trust her judgment and the judgment of the students. But she was prepared. She had been through worse. She had faced ridicule, self-doubt, and public shaming, and she had emerged stronger on the other side. She had learned that leadership wasn't about being perfect. It was about learning from mistakes and being willing to adapt. She presented her plan confidently, addressing every concern with patience and reason. The board listened intently, and as the discussion unfolded, Karen realized that this was not just about phones. It was about fostering an environment where students were empowered, where they could learn how to balance technology with self-discipline. The decision wasn't immediate, but over the following weeks, the school board approved the initiative, and the policy was put into place. The moment was a quiet victory. The ban was off the table, and instead, there was a renewed sense of purpose around technology in the school. For Karen, it wasn't about the policy. It was about how she had found her voice again, how she had turned a moment of failure into something transformative, something that would benefit the students she had devoted her life to. At home, Karen's relationship with Matt had also begun to improve. It wasn't a dramatic change, but there was an openness between them now, a willingness to communicate that had been lacking for so long. He still didn't always agree with her, and she didn't expect him to. But there were moments, small, quiet moments, where they shared a look or a laugh, and Karen realized that their bond was healing. She wasn't the iPhone flusher to him anymore. She was his mom, the one who had made a mistake, but had also taken the time to make things right. It was around this time that Karen received a letter from a former student, one who had graduated the year before. The letter was simple but heartfelt, expressing gratitude for the way Karen had taught him not just academics, but life lessons. He wrote about how she had always been open, always willing to admit when she didn't have all the answers. He thanked her for her honesty and for showing him that failure wasn't the end, but the beginning of a new chapter. The letter moved Karen deeply, and in that moment, she realized that her actions, good or bad, had always been part of something bigger. She wasn't just shaping her own future, she was shaping the future of the students she worked with, and that responsibility was one she took seriously. The incident on the plane had, in many ways, reshaped her entire perspective. It had forced her to confront her vulnerabilities, her need for control, and the ways in which she had insulated herself from the messiness of life. But it had also shown her the importance of resilience, of owning one's mistakes, and of finding the courage to change. The Karen who flushed her iPhone would always be a part of her story, but it wasn't the defining part. What mattered now was what she had done with that moment. She had grown from it, learned from it, and ultimately used it to teach others the importance of accountability and self-reflection. As the summer arrived, Karen took some time off to reflect. She spent more time with Matt, took long walks through the park, and spent afternoons reading and writing in her journal. She found herself more at peace, more present in the moment than she had been in a long time. The world had moved on, and so had she. The public ridicule had faded, but the lessons from that experience would stay with her forever. And as she sat in her quiet home, looking out at the sunset, Karen allowed herself one final reflection. Despite all the chaos and all the setbacks, she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected to the people who mattered most in her life. The path forward wasn't always clear, and it certainly wasn't easy, but for the first time in a long while, Karen felt ready to face whatever came next. The world would continue to change, and she would change with it. What mattered now is that she was no longer afraid of what the future held. She had learned to embrace the uncertainty, the messiness, and the beauty of living with intention.